The encounter that changed everything. The holiday season at Grandview International Airport was always a spectacle. Glittering wreaths adorned every entrance, Christmas lights twinkled above the bustling crowds, and the smell of cinnamon and fresh pine lingered in the air. But while most people rushed through the terminals with excitement, eager to reunite with their loved ones, one small figure stood near the entrance, shivering slightly in the cold. 10-year-old Oliver Evans adjusted his oversized coat, the sleeves nearly swallowing his small hands, and looked up at the passing travelers with hopeful eyes. He held a stack of bright red and green flyers, their festive colors matching the decorations around him. "Merry Christmas," he called, stretching out a flyer to a woman in a sleek business suit. She barely glanced at him before hurrying past, dragging her suitcase behind her. Oliver sighed but quickly composed himself. Rejection wasn't new to him. He moved a little closer to the terminal doors, where warm air escaped each time someone entered, giving him a brief moment of comfort. He tried again. "Merry Christmas, sir. Would you like a flyer?" This time, an older man in a wool coat paused, eyeing the flyer. With a small smile, he took it and read the message Oliver had carefully handwritten the night before. "The smallest acts of kindness can change the world. Believe in love. Believe in hope. Merry Christmas." The man gave Oliver a nod. "That's a nice message, son." Oliver beamed. "Thank you, sir. Happy holidays." The man walked away, and Oliver felt a flicker of warmth in his heart. Even if only a few people took his flyers, maybe, just maybe, one of them would be inspired to do something kind today. Oliver had always believed in kindness. Even though he had no family of his own, he had seen how small acts of generosity could make a difference. At St. Mary's Orphanage, where he had lived for as long as he could remember, the caretakers did their best, but resources were always tight. That was why he had spent his last few weeks writing out these messages, hoping that, in the spirit of Christmas, people would remember the power of giving. As he prepared to hand out another flyer, a sudden commotion broke through the holiday cheer. A loud thump followed by a frantic shout made Oliver whip his head toward the curbside drop-off area. A man had collapsed onto the icy pavement, clutching his chest. His face was pale, his breaths labored. People gasped, but no one moved immediately, frozen by uncertainty. Oliver didn't hesitate. Rushing forward, he dropped his flyers and skidded to his knees beside the man. "Sir? Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. The man's eyes fluttered open, filled with pain and confusion. His fingers gripped his chest tightly, and his breathing came in uneven gasps. Oliver's heart pounded. He had seen something like this before at the orphanage. An older caretaker had suffered a heart attack last year. He knew time was critical. Spotting the man's phone, Oliver quickly picked it up. His fingers trembled slightly as he unlocked it using the emergency dial feature and called 911. "We need an ambulance at Grandview International Airport. A man is having a heart attack, he's still conscious but struggling to breathe." The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm. "Stay with him. Help is on the way." "Can you describe his condition?" Oliver looked at the man. His forehead was damp with sweat despite the cold. His breaths were shallow, and his lips were slightly blue. "He's sweating a lot, and he's holding his chest really tightly," Oliver reported. "I think he's in a lot of pain." "You're doing great," the dispatcher reassured. "Try to keep him awake and calm. Can you ask if he has any medication?" Oliver turned back to the man. "Sir, do you have medicine? Anything you usually take?" The man barely managed a weak shake of his head. His fingers twitched toward his coat pocket but fell limp before reaching it. Oliver carefully patted the pocket and found a small bottle of pills. He read the label, nitroglycerin. "I found some medicine in his pocket. Should I give it to him?" "Yes," the dispatcher confirmed. Place one pill under his tongue. It should help ease the chest pain. Oliver followed the instructions with careful hands. The man's breathing slowed slightly, but he still looked weak. The airport staff had now gathered, whispering among themselves. Some finally pulled out their phones, either recording or calling for help. But Oliver stayed focused. "Help is coming, sir. Just hold on," he said softly. A minute later, the wailing of sirens cut through the air. Paramedics rushed in, their uniforms standing out starkly against the holiday decorations. Oliver quickly stepped back to let them work, his chest tightening as they carefully checked the man's vitals. He didn't know who this man was, but he desperately hoped he would survive. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, the man's half-lidded eyes met Oliver's. His lips parted slightly as if trying to say something, but the words never came. Then, the ambulance doors shut, and they sped away. Oliver stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, his small hand still clutching the man's phone. A security officer walked over. "Kid, you did good. What's your name?" "Oliver," he said quietly. "Well, Oliver, I think you just saved that man's life." The weight of the moment settled in his chest. He had only done what felt right, what anyone should do. But as he looked around at the people who had simply watched until the very last second, he realized that maybe, just maybe, kindness wasn't as common as it should be. With a deep breath, Oliver walked back to where his flyers lay scattered on the ground. He picked them up one by one, determined to keep spreading the message that had been in his heart all along. Little did he know that his simple act of bravery had just set in motion something that would change his life forever. A powerful man searches for his savior. The rhythmic beeping of machines echoed softly in the private suite of Grandview Medical Center. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, blending with the muted hum of conversations outside the room. Charles Kensington, a name synonymous with power and success, slowly opened his eyes. The world around him was blurred at first, like a dream slipping away before he could grasp it. His throat was dry, his chest ached, but more than anything, a strange sensation of vulnerability washed over him, a feeling he had not known in years. His eyes darted around the hospital room, taking in the unfamiliar sight of medical equipment and a quiet nurse checking his for. It was a stark contrast to the grand offices and luxury hotels he was accustomed to. For the first time in a long while, Charles Kensington was not in control. "Where am I?" His voice came out rough, weaker than he would have liked. The nurse turned, offering a professional yet kind smile. "You're in Grandview Medical Center, sir. You suffered a heart attack at the airport." A heart attack. The words hit him like a freight train. He had always been a man of precision, never missing a business deal, never taking a step without calculating every possible outcome. Yet, his own body had betrayed him. Flashes of that moment played in his mind, the crushing weight in his chest, the air slipping away, the growing fear that this was the end. Then, a boy. He wasn't sure if it had been real or a dream, but he remembered small hands gripping his, a steady voice keeping him grounded, and deep brown eyes filled with concern. A child. Charles sat up slightly, wincing as pain lanced through his ribs. "There was a boy," he murmured. "Where is he?" The nurse hesitated. "I'm not sure, sir. The paramedics brought you in unconscious." "Do you remember who he was?" Charles clenched his jaw. He didn't know the boy's name, but he knew one thing for certain, he was alive because of him. The nurse adjusted his pillow. "You should rest, Mr. Kensington. You've been through a lot." Rest? That wasn't in his nature. Charles gestured for his assistant, Daniel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for instructions. "Find him," Charles ordered. "Find the boy who saved me." Daniel hesitated. "Sir, we don't have much to go on. Do you remember what he looked like?" Charles closed his eyes, forcing his weary mind to focus. He pictured the boy's face, young, determined, kind. He had dark hair. Worn-out clothes. But his eyes, they were full of something I haven't seen in a long time. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What's that, sir?" "Genuine compassion," Charles murmured. For a man who had built an empire on ruthless efficiency, that simple human connection had struck him like lightning. Daniel, ever the problem solver, nodded. "I'll start making calls. The search begins." The next morning, Charles Kensington's name was all over the news, but this time, it wasn't about business or wealth. Billionaire saved by mysterious boy, search underway for young hero. News anchors spoke excitedly about the unknown child who had saved the powerful businessman. Speculation ran wild. Who was he? Where had he come from? What reward would he receive? Social media erupted with theories. Some believed he was a runaway, others thought he was a secret genius, and a few even joked that he was an angel sent to teach the billionaire a lesson. The Kensington Corporation offered a substantial reward for information leading to the boy's identity. The story captured hearts across the country, because for once, it wasn't about money, power, or business deals. It was about kindness. Yet, despite the media frenzy, the search led to dead ends. Airport security footage showed the incident, but the boy had no known records. He had no luggage, no guardian, no ticket. He was like a ghost in the system. Until, finally, a breakthrough. A woman at St. Mary's Orphanage saw the news and recognized the description. "That's Oliver," she told the reporter. "He's one of our boys." The call reached Kensington's office within minutes. Charles sat in his hospital bed, staring out at the city skyline, deep in thought, when Daniel walked in. "We found him, sir." Charles turned sharply. "Where?" "St. Mary's Orphanage. His name is Oliver Evans. An orphan." Charles felt something stir in his chest, not just gratitude, but something deeper. A realization. This boy who had saved him had nothing. No family. No home of his own. And yet, he had given without expecting anything in return. Charles didn't wait another second. "Prepare the car," he ordered. "I want to meet him now." The unexpected reunion. The drive to St. Mary's Orphanage took 30 minutes. Charles, dressed in a tailored black coat, stepped out of his sleek limousine and took in the sight before him. The orphanage was old but well kept. The playground outside had rusted swings, and the paint on the walls had begun to chip, but there was warmth in the air, something different from the sterile, high-class world he was used to. Inside, children ran around, their laughter filling the halls. He noticed how some of their clothes were patched, how the walls had handmade decorations rather than expensive art, yet everything felt more alive than any boardroom he had ever walked into. Then, he saw him. Oliver was sweeping the front steps, humming softly to himself. His coat was still oversized, his shoes still too big, but there was an unmistakable lightness in his steps. The moment Charles stepped forward, Oliver froze. His brown eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "You," he breathed. "You're the man from the airport." Charles nodded, his throat unexpectedly tight. "And you're the boy who saved my life." Sister Margaret, the head of the orphanage, stepped beside Oliver, watching the exchange curiously. "I had to find you," Charles continued. "To thank you." Oliver blinked, shifting awkwardly. "You don't have to, sir. I just did what anyone should do." But Charles knew better. Not anyone would have helped. He took a slow breath. "The world expects me to reward you with riches, Oliver." Oliver's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his eyes. Charles continued, his voice quiet but firm. "But I don't want to assume what you need. So tell me, anything you want, money, a new home, a scholarship, anything, it's yours." Silence hung in the air. The other children peeked from behind doors, watching. Even Sister Margaret seemed to hold her breath. For a long moment, Oliver just stared at him. Then, with an innocence that shook Charles to his core, the boy spoke. "I don't want money," Oliver said softly. "I just want you to spend Christmas with me." A stunned hush fell over the room. Charles, the billionaire who could buy anything, felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Tears burned at the back of his eyes. Of all the things in the world, the boy had asked for his time. His presence. His heart. For the first time in years, Charles Kensington felt truly human. And without hesitation, he whispered, "Then that's exactly what we'll do. A Christmas like no other." The children of St. Mary's Orphanage had never seen a man like Charles Kensington up close. They had only heard of men like him, powerful, unreachable, existing in a world completely different from their own. And yet, there he stood, in the heart of their humble home, looking at Oliver not as a billionaire looking down at an orphan but as a man who had just been given a second chance at life. When Charles Kensington had offered Oliver anything he wanted, riches, a new home, an education, no one had expected the boy to simply ask, "Spend Christmas with me." It was so simple. So pure. And yet, it shook Charles to his very core. For years, Christmas had been nothing more than another date on the calendar for him. While others celebrated with family, he had buried himself in work, shutting out emotions and drowning in numbers, deals, and deadlines. But now, as Oliver looked at him with those hopeful brown eyes, he realized that this was the first time in decades someone had wanted him, not his wealth. Just him. An unexpected guest at St. Mary's. The children whispered excitedly as Charles Kensington followed Oliver and Sister Margaret inside the orphanage. The walls were adorned with handmade paper snowflakes, the scent of freshly baked gingerbread filled the air, and laughter echoed from the common room where some of the children were decorating a modest Christmas tree. It was nothing like the grand holiday parties Charles had been invited to over the years, no expensive crystal chandeliers, no orchestras, no endless champagne towers. But there was something here that none of those events had ever had. Warmth. Love. A sense of belonging. As they entered the dining area, Oliver pulled out a chair. "You can sit here," he said, smiling. Charles hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering himself into the wooden chair. He wasn't used to this. No business meetings, no formal dinners with industry leaders, just a simple meal with a group of children who had no family of their own. One of the younger girls, a freckled child named Lily, leaned in close, eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you a king?" she asked innocently. Charles chuckled, a genuine, unguarded chuckle. "No, just a businessman." Lily squinted as if trying to determine whether or not to believe him. "You look like a king. Or maybe Santa Claus." A ripple of laughter spread through the table. Oliver grinned. "I told them you were really important. But I think you're just a normal person, too." Something about those words made Charles pause. A normal person, too. For years, people had only ever seen him as Charles Kensington, the billionaire. They had bowed, catered to his every demand, walked on eggshells around him. But to Oliver, he was just a man. Something in his chest tightened at that thought. Sister Margaret brought out the food, simple but hearty. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, warm rolls, and steaming bowls of vegetable soup. "Forgive our humble meal, Mr. Kensington," she said kindly. "We don't have much, but we always make sure Christmas is special for the children." Charles shook his head. "This is more than enough." And for the first time in his life, he meant it. A lesson in joy. After dinner, Oliver led Charles to the common room, where a small Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner. It wasn't grand, it didn't have hundreds of golden ornaments or an extravagant star at the top. But it was decorated with care. Handmade paper chains, dried orange slices, and little drawings the children had made. "Do you want to help put the star on top?" Oliver asked, holding up a small, slightly crooked golden star made of cardboard and glitter. Charles hesitated. He had never decorated a tree himself, those things had always been done by staff. But as he saw the anticipation in Oliver's eyes, he reached out and took the star. Oliver grinned. "You're tall. You can reach." Charles stepped forward and carefully placed the star at the top. The children clapped and cheered. For the first time in decades, Charles Kensington felt something foreign yet strangely familiar. Joy. Real joy. Not the kind that came from sealing $1 million deal. Not the kind that came from being on the front page of Forbes. But the kind that came from knowing he belonged. A night of stories and laughter. As the night stretched on, Charles sat with the children by the fireplace, listening to their stories and laughter. One boy, Tommy, proudly showed him a toy car he had made out of cardboard. "I want to be an engineer when I grow up," he said. Charles nodded. "You'd make a great one." Another girl, Sarah, showed him a book with her drawings. "I love to draw. But I only have 2 pencils." Charles frowned. "What would you draw if you had more?" "Everything," she said excitedly. "The whole world." Charles watched as the children, despite having so little, dreamed so big. He had spent his life surrounded by men and women who had everything and yet never seemed satisfied. But here, in this small orphanage, were children who had almost nothing and still found joy in the simplest things. It humbled him. It changed him. As the clock neared midnight, Oliver looked up at Charles. "This is the best Christmas ever," the boy said softly. "Because I'm not alone." Something inside Charles cracked. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled Oliver into a gentle embrace. "You'll never be alone again," he whispered. Oliver stiffened for a moment, then slowly melted into the hug. For the first time in his life, Charles Kensington, the billionaire who had everything but felt nothing, realized what he had been missing all along. Family. Not by blood. Not by contracts or business deals. But by love. The offer that changed everything. The next morning, Charles made a decision that shocked the world. He didn't just donate money to St. Mary's Orphanage. He didn't just set up a scholarship for Oliver. Instead, he did something no one expected. He stood before the children and Sister Margaret, looked straight at Oliver, and said, "How would you feel about coming home with me?" Oliver blinked. "What do you mean?" Charles took a deep breath. "I don't just want to help for a day. I want to be your father. If you'll have me." The room fell silent. Oliver's lip trembled. You want to adopt me?" Charles nodded. "Yes." Tears welled in Oliver's eyes as he nodded furiously. "Yes. I'd love that." The next thing Charles knew, Oliver had thrown himself into his arms, holding on as if he were afraid to wake up from a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And for the first time in both of their lives, they knew. They had found home. A life transformed. The adoption process took time. There were legal documents to be reviewed, social workers to be consulted, and approvals to be granted. Charles Kensington was used to moving mountains in the business world, but this time, the stakes were different. This time, it wasn't about numbers or contracts. It was about love. And love, he was realizing, didn't follow the same rules as business. Adjusting to a new life. For Oliver, life had always been uncertain. Every morning at the orphanage had been the same: wake up in a small shared room, help with chores, eat whatever food had been donated that week, and hope that maybe, just maybe, a family would come looking for him. But now, as he stepped into Charles Kensington's mansion for the first time, he felt like he had walked into another world. The floors gleamed, reflecting the enormous chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with artwork Oliver had only seen in books. There was a grand staircase leading up to what he imagined were dozens of rooms. It was overwhelming. A butler in a pressed suit greeted them at the door. "Welcome home, Master Oliver." "Home." Oliver swallowed, gripping his small backpack. Thank you." Charles, sensing his unease, knelt beside him. "This is all new, I know. But I don't expect you to change who you are. You don't have to act different or dress different. This is your home now, and you can be you." Oliver hesitated. "Even if I like ketchup on my macaroni?" Charles chuckled. "Even if you like ketchup on your macaroni." Oliver grinned. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. The challenges of fatherhood. For all his wealth and intelligence, Charles quickly realized one thing: he had no idea how to be a father. Running a multi-billion-dollar company? Easy. Raising a 10-year-old boy? A completely different challenge. The first time Oliver got a cold, Charles panicked and called 3 doctors. Oliver, amused but exhausted, had to reassure him that people do recover from the flu. The first time Oliver had a nightmare, Charles, unused to comforting anyone, awkwardly sat on the edge of his bed until Oliver sighed and said, "You can just hug me, you know." So Charles did. And he was surprised by how much he needed it, too. The first time Oliver had a school project, he asked for help making a volcano. Charles, not knowing how normal fathers helped with homework, hired an actual scientist. Oliver had laughed until he cried. "You really don't know how to do normal dad stuff, huh?" Charles sighed. "Not yet. But he was learning. And every small moment, every shared meal, every inside joke, every bedtime story, was proof that he was doing something right." The media storm. News of the billionaire who had adopted an orphan spread like wildfire. Some people were skeptical. Why would a man like Charles Kensington adopt a random boy? Was this a PR stunt? Was there some hidden agenda? The tabloids speculated endlessly. But those who truly knew Oliver and Charles saw the truth. They saw it in the way Charles attended every school meeting, despite never having set foot in a classroom since his own days as a student. They saw it in the way Oliver clung to Charles's hand when cameras swarmed them, as if silently telling the world, "He's mine now." They saw it in the way Charles, once cold and ruthless, became a man who laughed more, who softened, who finally understood that the greatest wealth in the world wasn't in stocks or properties. It was in family. Oliver's biggest wish. As weeks turned into months, Oliver adjusted to his new life. He had a room of his own, filled with books and toys and warm blankets. He had a school where he made friends. But there was still something missing. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Oliver looked up from his homework and hesitated. Charles noticed. "Something on your mind?" Oliver bit his lip. "I was just thinking. I've never had a real birthday before." Charles frowned. "Never?" Oliver shook his head. "At the orphanage, we celebrated in a small way, but no one really got their own day. Just a cake for all the kids born that month." Charles felt a strange ache in his chest. A boy who had saved a stranger's life, who had asked for nothing in return, had never even had a birthday of his own. Not on his watch. A birthday to remember. A week later, Oliver woke up to a normal morning, or so he thought. When he stepped out of his room, he found the hallway lined with balloons. Confused, he followed them down the stairs. When he reached the living room, he gasped. The entire space had been transformed. There were streamers, banners, and a giant sign that read, "Happy Birthday, Oliver." There were tables filled with his favorite foods, yes, even macaroni with ketchup. A stack of presents stood in the corner, but what caught Oliver's attention the most were the people. Sister Margaret and the kids from the orphanage were there. His new school friends were there. Even the butler looked slightly less stiff, holding a party hat in his hands. And in the middle of it all, was Charles. Holding a cake. Oliver's eyes filled with tears. You did all this?" Charles nodded. "Of course. It's your first real birthday." Oliver swallowed hard. "I don't need presents. I don't need a big party. He wiped his eyes. "I just needed someone to remember." Charles knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'll always remember." For the first time in his life, Oliver blew out the candles on a cake made just for him. And for the first time in his life, he made a wish. Except this time, he didn't have to wish for a family. Because he already had one. The true meaning of family. For the first time in his life, Oliver Evans woke up feeling truly safe. It had been almost a year since Charles Kensington had adopted him, and yet, every morning still felt like a dream, one he was afraid to wake up from. There were no creaking orphanage beds, no whispered prayers that today would be the day someone picked him. Instead, there were warm blankets, his own room, and the comforting sound of soft footsteps outside his door, footsteps that, after months of learning them, he now recognized as Charles's. Still, a small part of him held on to an old fear. What if this doesn't last? What if one day, he changes his mind? It was a fear that had been planted in him long before Charles had come into his life. A fear that told him happiness was temporary, that love came with conditions. And though Charles had never once given him a reason to doubt his place in their new family, that fear still whispered in the back of Oliver's mind. Would it ever truly go away? A different kind of love. Over the past year, Charles had learned that fatherhood wasn't about grand gestures. Yes, he could buy Oliver the best clothes, the newest books, and send him to the most prestigious schools. But he had quickly realized that what Oliver truly needed wasn't something money could buy. It was in the small things. Like waiting outside his classroom after school, even though he had never picked up anyone before. Like remembering that Oliver hated cucumbers but loved strawberries. Like sitting beside him when he had a bad dream, instead of sending someone else to comfort him. And in those small things, Charles had discovered something he never thought he would. Love wasn't about what you gave, it was about how present you were. And that scared him more than anything. Because in all his years of business, in all his years of success, he had never truly belonged anywhere. Until now. An unwanted visit. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Oliver was drawing in the study, the butler entered with a cautious look on his face. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Charles, who had been going over some papers, barely looked up. "If it's another journalist, tell them no." "It's not a journalist, sir." The hesitation in the butler's voice made Charles finally glance up. "It's your sister." Silence. Oliver looked up from his drawing. Charles slowly set his pen down. "I don't have a sister," he said evenly. The butler shifted uncomfortably. "I believe she said her name is Eleanor Kensington." Oliver frowned. "Who's that?" Charles exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Someone I haven't seen in years." A long pause. Then, he stood. "Let her in." Oliver had never seen Charles look so closed off before. The Kensington legacy. Eleanor Kensington walked into the room with the kind of elegance only someone born into wealth could possess. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her heels clicked against the floor with confidence, and her sharp green eyes swept over Oliver with thinly veiled disapproval. "Well," she said, setting her designer bag down on the expensive leather chair. "I had to see it for myself." Charles's jaw tightened. "See what?" Eleanor gestured vaguely toward Oliver. "This experiment of yours." Oliver shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he didn't like the way she was looking at him. Charles's voice was cold. He's not an experiment. He's my son. Eleanor let out a soft, humorless laugh. Charles, we both know that's not true. Charles stepped forward, his presence commanding. Why are you here, Eleanor? Eleanor sighed, picking up a crystal figurine from the desk and examining it absent-mindedly. Because, she said smoothly, our family name means something. And you're tarnishing it. Charles's fists clenched. Eleanor continued, as if she hadn't just insulted him. The Kensington name is built on power, reputation. And yet, here you are, playing father to a street rat. Oliver stiffened. The words shouldn't have hurt, he had been called worse. But somehow, coming from someone connected to Charles, they did. Charles, however, didn't even blink. My name, he said, voice steady, is mine to do with as I please. Eleanor sighed dramatically. You've never cared about children, Charles. You're not father material. She glanced at Oliver. Do you really think he'll stay? That he won't leave you the moment he realizes this isn't where he belongs? Something inside Oliver cracked. It was the same fear he had always carried. The fear that this was temporary. That one day, Charles would wake up and realize he had made a mistake. That he would be sent back. Charles, sensing Oliver's silence, turned to him. And in that moment, Oliver saw something in his eyes he had never seen before. Fury. Not at him. But for him. Charles took a step closer to Eleanor, his voice low and dangerous. You listen to me, he said. I have spent my entire life building something I thought mattered. But I've come to realize that the most valuable thing I have isn't my company, or my wealth, or my reputation. He turned, resting a hand gently on Oliver's shoulder. It's him. Oliver's breath caught. Eleanor scoffed. You're serious. Deadly, Charles replied. Eleanor's lips curled in distaste. This isn't over, Charles. You'll see. With one final glare, she turned on her heel and strode out. The room was silent. Then, Oliver spoke, voice barely above a whisper. She's right, isn't she? Charles frowned. About what? Oliver swallowed. That. I don't belong here. Charles immediately knelt down so they were eye level. You belong wherever you are loved, Oliver. And I love you. You are my son. The words hit Oliver harder than he expected. His throat tightened. Even if I mess up? Even then? Even if I'm not like you? Especially then. Oliver hesitated. Even if I still get scared sometimes? Charles softened. Oliver. I get scared, too. Oliver blinked. You do? Charles nodded. I'm scared of failing you. I'm scared I won't know how to be the father you deserve. But I'm never scared of loving you. Oliver's chest ached. And then, without thinking, he threw himself into Charles's arms. Charles held him tight, one hand cradling the back of his head, the other wrapped securely around him. And for the first time, Oliver let go of the fear that one day, this would all disappear. Because he finally believed. He was home. And nothing could take that away from him, the legacy of love. The seasons changed, and so did Oliver's life. It had been over a year since Charles Kensington had adopted him, and yet, there were still days when Oliver would wake up expecting to find himself back in the orphanage, his time in this warm, safe world nothing more than a dream. But then he would hear Charles's voice downstairs, arguing, poorly, with the cook about how much syrup belonged on pancakes. He would hear the butler reminding Charles of yet another missed suit fitting, only for Charles to wave him off, saying, I'm busy. Oliver and I have a chess match to finish. And then Oliver would smile, realizing, once again, that this wasn't a dream. This was home. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing it. An unlikely pair. If anyone had told Charles Kensington a year ago that he would be waking up at 6 in the morning to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for a 10-year-old, he would have laughed them out of his office. But here he was, standing in his lavish kitchen, struggling to spread peanut butter while Oliver watched in amusement. "You're putting way too much," Oliver said, leaning on the counter. Charles frowned at the gooey mess on the bread. "Is there such a thing as too much peanut butter?" "Yes." "No." "Yes." Charles sighed, setting the knife down. "Fine. You do it." Oliver smirked and took over, making a perfectly balanced sandwich in seconds. "See? It's an art," Oliver said proudly. Charles crossed his arms, watching. "And what exactly makes you an expert on sandwiches?" Oliver shrugged. "Years of experience. We used to make our own at the orphanage when the sisters were busy." Something about that simple statement made Charles's heart tighten. Even now, no matter how comfortable Oliver had become in his new home, the past still lingered in small ways. The way he never wasted food. The way he folded his clothes carefully, even though he had a walk-in closet filled with more than he could ever wear. The way he still sometimes hesitated before asking for something, as if expecting to be told no. Charles had once believed money could fix anything. But some wounds took time to heal. And he was willing to give Oliver all the time in the world. The moment that changed everything. One evening, Charles was in his study when Oliver walked in, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "What's that?" Charles asked, setting his reading glasses down. Oliver shifted awkwardly. "It's, something for school." Charles gestured for him to come closer. "Let me see." Oliver hesitated before handing it over. It was a simple worksheet titled, "Who is your hero?" Charles scanned the page. The students had been asked to write a short paragraph about someone who had changed their lives. And there, in Oliver's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words that made Charles's throat tighten. "My hero is my dad." For a man who had once measured success in numbers and profits, those 5 words meant more than any billion-dollar deal. Charles blinked, his voice softer than usual. "You mean this?" Oliver nodded, suddenly nervous. "Well, yeah. I mean, I didn't know what to write at first. I thought maybe I should write about someone famous, but then I realized. I already knew who my hero was." Charles swallowed, setting the paper down carefully as if it were made of glass. "I don't know what to say." Oliver smiled. "You don't have to say anything." Charles let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he pulled Oliver into a tight embrace. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Because sometimes, love didn't need words. A new purpose. That night, Charles lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For years, his life had been defined by one goal, power. But now, for the first time, he realized that power meant nothing if it wasn't used to make the world better. So the next morning, he called a meeting with his legal team. "I want to start a foundation," he announced. His lawyers exchanged glances. "A foundation, sir?" "Yes. A non-profit dedicated to supporting orphanages, providing scholarships, and helping kids who never got the chances they deserved." One of his senior advisors cleared his throat. "Forgive me, sir, but this isn't exactly in line with your usual investments." Charles smiled. "It is now." And just like that, the Kensington Foundation for Children was born. The final surprise. A few weeks later, Charles and Oliver stood in front of St. Mary's Orphanage, the place where their journey had begun. But today was different. The old, worn-down orphanage was gone. In its place stood a newly renovated building, brighter, bigger, and filled with everything the children needed. As the doors opened, revealing new beds, books, and classrooms, Sister Margaret covered her mouth in shock. "Charles, you did this?" she whispered. Charles shook his head and glanced at Oliver. "We did this." Oliver looked up at him, his heart full. Not long ago, he had stood in these very halls, believing he would always be alone. Now, he had a father, a home, and a purpose. As the children ran inside, exploring their new home, Charles put a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "You once asked me for only one thing," Charles said. "To spend Christmas with you." Oliver grinned. "Yeah. Well," Charles said, looking at the children laughing in the distance, "I think you ended up giving me the greatest gift of all." Oliver's smile softened. "What's that?" Charles rested a hand over his heart. "A reason to believe in love again." Epilogue, a legacy of love. Years later, Oliver stood at the front of a grand hall, now a young man, delivering a speech. "My father taught me many things," he said, smiling at the crowd. "He taught me how to play chess, how to negotiate a deal, how to tie a tie, badly." Laughter rippled through the audience. "But most of all, he taught me that love isn't measured in wealth or power. It's measured in the lives we touch, in the kindness we give, in the family we choose." He turned toward Charles, now older but still strong, sitting proudly in the front row. "And because of him, I will spend my life sharing that love with others." The crowd erupted in applause. And as Charles wiped his eyes, he knew, without a doubt, that adopting Oliver had been the greatest decision of his life. Because in the end, the legacy that truly mattered wasn't money. It was love.